Becky Burleigh, welcome to the Wade Champions podcast. Jerry and I are so honored to have you on.
I'm excited to be here. This is like being with two legends.
Ooh,
Oh boy.
I don't know about that.
What a setup that's going to be for us.
Yeah. This is
We better be good, John.
can only go downhill from here. But Becky, it's amazing. We've been trying to make this happen for the last couple of years, and between the end of your coaching career at the University of Florida and an intern stint with Orlando and the NWSL, we finally caught you on vacation in Cape Cod. It's fantastic. Maybe you can just give our listeners kind of a quick overview, especially of your coaching career, which I think started at the ripe old age of 21.
Yes, I don't recommend that, by the way,
Yeah.
being a head coach at 21 of college athletes. But it was a great learning experience for sure. Maybe I feel a little sorry for those early teams, but I think what's cool is that, I got so many reps at a young age. Even while I was in college, my college coach at the time, Joe Pereira, was in charge of the Region 3 ODP. And that was a big deal at that time. And so I was working with these like really high quality players while I was in college. And then when I graduated from college, I started at Barry. I graduated in May, took the job at Barry in June, stayed at Barry for 5 years and loved that experience. They were NAIA at the time, even though they're D3 now. So we played in the NAIA National Championship, won two of those, and then came to Florida. And even at 26, I felt like a baby at a place like Florida because everybody was so good and experienced and the spotlight's a lot bigger. And then ended up staying there for 27 years before thinking I was retiring, but then stepping into that interim stint with the Pride for 6 months and then finally retiring from coaching.
It's been, an incredible journey, an NCAA championship. I've got it here, 14 SEC championships, 12 tournament ones. 500 wins. You've been a coach that I've admired for so long. What I love now too is, you're giving back to the coaching community as well. And it was funny because like when you said, I don't recommend anyone coaching at 21, I don't think we've ever interviewed a coach on this podcast who coached for, decades like you have, who looks back on those first years, all that like, oh man, I was great. They're all kind of like, hey, I'd like to apologize to those first players. I'm the same way. Like we all learn and evolve. That's what keeps us in it. And I think we go back. What do you wish you knew when you were 21 that you knew later that you would have done differently?
Oh my gosh, so much. I don't think we have enough time on the podcast to put out the list. But I just think that, the good thing about being a really young coach is that it's like a blank slate. You can just learn so much from your players, from other coaches, from other people in your department. The hard thing about that is that you're kind of learning on the job. And certainly there's some things you would probably do differently if you knew better.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, I think it's a great way to, like, it was very scary for me to say, hey, yeah, I'll step into this role at 21. But then, you know what? It was a little scary to step into the Orlando Pride role, 30 years later. And so it's like, if it doesn't scare you a little bit, then you probably shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Comment.
Yeah, it is a great comment. I think anything, if you're a little scared, it means you care too. It means you want to do well. Like if you weren't scared, if you didn't care, you'd just be like, well, who cares? It all blows up in my face. So, and now talk a little bit just to kind of get the full picture for people. Talk about what drives winning and the work that you've done with Brett Ledbetter. And Brett's obviously been on the podcast here and stuff. Talk about how you're giving back to the coaching community in that way.
Well, I think because I was like sort of thrown into it like I was, I would love to have had some resources and some support. And I did in my own way. Like the people who surrounded me, I was just super lucky with the people who were near me at the beginning of my career. But in a formal way, it's so nice to have those resources. And I feel like that's what we're trying to do with What Drives Winning, is try to create an opportunity for people to have a community as well as resources to help them through anything except the X's and O's. I mean, you can find thousands of X's and O's stuff on YouTube and anywhere else, but I think it's really hard to find some of the more complex issues and things that our coaches are facing right now as almost like CEOs as opposed to coaches. Like, where do you find that stuff? And that's kind of what we're trying to provide.
Yeah, it's lovely. And the challenge, I mean, Jerry and I do that in our own way as well. And the challenge that people say is, well, like you guys have had like Gino Auriemma on, like, well, it's great. You coach at UConn. I coach at Joe Smith High School. It's different. How do you bridge the gap for the coach coaching club soccer or high school basketball? Because, like, again, we will bring on a Steve Kerr or Brad Stevens or Anson or someone or yourself, and people say, well, that's different than where I am. But it's also, I feel like, important because the things that you all talk about that we'll get into here about love and connection and trust and all these things, these apply at any level because we're coaching human beings. So how do we bridge that gap? Yeah.
Bill Bezic, who, presents at our soccer coaches convention year after year, and he's been like just the best ambassador from the UK for soccer people. He has this saying that he talks about, you're coaching human beings, not human doings. And that always really stuck with me because people are people. And honestly, that's kind of what makes our job so interesting, is that you might think, it's kind of stale to learn how to coach a 3-5-2 or a 4-4-2, but it's never going to be stale to coach people because they're always going to be different and provide different challenges. And, people ask me all the time, are kids different now than when you first started coaching? And I'm like, of course they are, because like parenting is different, environment is different, social media is existing and it didn't exist then. Like there's so many things that have changed, and that changes people. And so that part always evolves. And I would hope, as a coach, and me even not coaching now, just as a person, that I would continue to evolve with the things that are changing around me.
Yeah, definitely. Jerry, why don't you jump in here because I'll just keep going.
I don't know if I should. I mean, you're on a roll, man. That last question was awesome. And I don't want to interfere with this process here, but I've got so many things to ask and talk about as well. But anyway, to me, Becky, following your career and talking with Alan, your longtime assistant at Florida, what comes to mind for me with your leadership is the word trust, and the importance of that. And so many coaches that we just did a coaching conference, and that subject came up, and boy, that was a hot topic because people didn't know, what do we do about that? How do we develop the trust? And one of the comments that was said was, if you really want to trust your athlete, if you want your athletes to trust you, you have to trust them. And it starts from that place, which I thought was kind of a brilliant comment. But following your program, you've had some really interesting ways, very important ways, I feel, that help build that trust. And I just sort of listed two of them down there that I researched, and oh my God, it was like, oh yeah, this is it. Like that swim test that you guys get involved in, or the wrist tie. The wrist tie was brilliant. I want to do that with my family, So I'm wondering if you could just help some of the coaches listening to us, the younger coaches, that they can do things like this with great success. Could you give a little chat about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, if you want to see what those two things that you're referring to, those videos both exist on whatdriveswinning.com, so you can check them out. But I do think you're right about the trust issue being really important, and it's whether it's with your players, with your staff, with yourself. Like that's a big one. Like, do you trust yourself?
Whoa, yeah. Wow.
But I think that the only way that you develop trust is through opportunities, to rely on somebody or something, like whether that's relying on yourself for self-trust, whether it's relying on others or something. And so you have to be able to put yourself in that. And we talk with What Drives Winning, especially in Brett's first book, What Drives Winning. He talks about the difference between trustworthy and trust willing, and I think this is such a great delineation, right? So trustworthy is you're reliable, and that's a great easy definition that's accessible to anyone. Like, do you say what you're gonna do and you do it? But trust willing is a whole nother concept, and the highest performers I know, trust willing is way harder for them than trustworthy. Trust willing is, are you willing to rely on someone or something? And for some people that's a challenge. And again, like, how do you build that? Well, you put them in situations where they have to, and that's where what you were referring to. So for example, with the swimming, we had this was pre-COVID, just so we all know. But it was we had to have these two athletes who were very much needing to trust each other based on their positions on the field where they played with each other. They swam from one end of the pool to the other using one snorkel. Well, it was an interesting activity because, first of all, I don't think they realized, like, when you pass a snorkel underwater, you first have to clear it because there's going to be water in it. So we had a few hiccups at the beginning, but once they figured that out, then you still have to, like, you have to give a little of yourself to each time because, I have to hold my breath while the other person's breathing. And maybe I need less of that and they need more of that, and trying to figure out what those dynamics are, and then the same with tying your wrist together to the person next to you. We did it at Florida. We did this. I remember specifically, we did not know it was going to be taco night when we did this, which made it even more challenging. So we had these round tables and everybody was tied to the person next to them. And so we were eating these tacos, and then one of the players was like, kind of want to get seconds. Like, this was really good. Well, like, the entire table had to go get seconds. They were all tied together. So it was an interesting evening, to say the least.
But you actually, I understand that you actually jumped in that pool yourself.
Oh yes,
as
Brett
a
and I were
coach.
like, okay, if we're gonna ask them to do it, we'll do it. And I'm a scuba diver, so snorkeling was very easy for me. So what took them like multiple times to try and get right, Brett and I did it right in the very first. Like, we swam from one end to the next in the first try, and they were a little annoyed by that, but we tried not to rub that in.
Well, I like the idea that as a coach, you're able to sweep the shed as well.
That's
You're
right.
able to get into the pool. You're able to get into the arena, sweat and get dirty and all of that. And that's a very good message in and of itself. So that I really appreciate that for sure. Yeah.
Where did you gain your ideas from coaching, and especially in this non-X's and O's side? Because I think for years, as a fellow soccer coach, we've had access to every there's no magic practice. No one's missing the magic practice. I've said on this podcast many times, I got a couple of years ago the opportunity to watch Pep Guardiola work with Bayern Munich, and he didn't have any magic practice that none of us has seen. He's just way better at it than we are, right? And so, but all these other things, what I saw with him in that moment was not only this passion and this energy, but individual connection over and over and over. And you could see his players knew he cared and they wanted to learn from him. And he was very intentional about one-on-one teaching and conversations, and not just teaching the group. Who were your coaching mentors as you sort of grew as a coach and evolved? And I think this is a two-part question. First, in soccer, which is, I think, where most of us start in our sport, but then outside of your sport, who shaped you?
Those are good questions. I would tell you this, a couple things I think that really shaped me. One was in high school, my high school coach was a mom of a player on our team. And she really went above and beyond. Like, we would watch film in high school. Like, I don't think anybody was doing that at the time. And she didn't live that far from the school. So like, what we would do is we would have a run to her house. She would provide us like food, which, is very motivating to a teenager. And then we would watch film. And it just, like, we were looked forward to those days. It was really fun. My youth coaches, I had really great people who really invested in me as a person. I mean, I know that one of my youth coaches bought me my first pair of cleats. Another one of my youth coaches paid for my ability to go to a soccer camp. And so that being ingrained in caring about the person, like worrying about me being able to fit in and do the thing with the team was like really ingrained in me early.
Hmm.
And then, like I said, when I got to college, I played Division III. And here's an interesting thing, like at Florida, there was not any other coach that hadn't played D1 in their sport and had been in the D1 system pretty much the entire time. And so I just think that D3 has a more holistic view of you as a person and an athlete. So that probably shaped me in some ways too. But I think what I didn't even know this at the time, if I'm being honest, like it took me a long, long time to be able to look back and understand this. But when I first got to Barry, here I am, 21 years old, right? I have 4 players on that team who are older than me, which is crazy. And this team is good. Ray Leone had coached this team prior to me getting there. They had won a national championship 2 years before. And I'm coming into this situation where I'm inheriting this very good team. And I'm thinking, I just hope I don't mess them up. But there was no way that I had like really any positional power, even though I was the head coach, because I was so young. Well, the 2 things that set up for me, one was I had to rely on other people. So like the men's coach at that time was a guy named Brett Simon, who went on to coach at Stanford.
Yeah.
Amazing help, because like I had no idea what I was doing at that point. My athletic director was a former soccer coach, Bob Pearson. So I had people around me that I had to rely on. Like I didn't really have a choice. And I couldn't use positional power with the athletes because honestly, I didn't have any as a 21-year-old. So all I could do was like, how can I serve them? How can I make sure that they know that I'm invested in them? And how can I influence their behavior as opposed to make them do anything? Well, then you'd think, okay, fast forward 5 years later, I'm at Florida. We've won 2 NAI national championships. Maybe now I kind of have an idea of what I'm doing, and maybe I have a little bit of positional power, but I'm going to Florida where like freaking it's Florida. Like, like every coach there is like amazing. People are winning national championships left and right all around you. And I'm only 26. So I'm thinking, wow, like I gotta rely on other people here too. And again, the Florida community, whether it was my athletic director, other coaches at Florida, were all so supportive. And I think they looked at me and were like, okay, she's like 26, like she's going to need help. So let's be ready to give that to her. So again, I had to rely on other people. I am now 26, but I'm recruiting kids like Abby Wambach, who obviously she could have gone anywhere in the country. Danielle Fotopoulos transfers in, she's the leading goal scorer in the country. Like, so I don't, again, really have positional power, which makes me rely on influence. And so that sort of set the tone for all of my coaching without it honestly really being intentional. It was just circumstantial.
That's amazing. I mean, because I think most of us learn that lesson the hard way, where we overuse our power and realize it doesn't work, and we need to focus on this relational influence instead. And it's like you were thrown into a circumstance where you had to figure out very quickly, I don't have it. I mean, that's amazing. I don't know that I've heard that story very often. I mean, I was right out of college where I got a high school JV coaching job, and I thought it was all about power and not influence. So that's really interesting. What about outside? I mean, you've talked about your influence of like a Brene Brown and that type of vulnerability and leadership. And I think you're even a certified facilitator in her work. So maybe talk about Brene Brown and why that resonates with you.
I really love her emphasis on vulnerability and her willingness to like study that, and trust, obviously. I mean, I think she has the most viewed TED Talk in the world on trust. And I've used that talk quite a bit in my coaching. But I think it's like seeing people who are leaders in their field. In this particular space, she's a researcher, but she has become like a leader in those studies. And you look at the topics that they're talking about, like no one's teaching like, okay, here's how to be the best dictator you can be.
Yeah.
They're talking about influence, and they're talking about vulnerability, and they're talking about trust. And those things to me, I think because it like, again, it wasn't like intentional as a young coach, but it became like a matter of survival. And I realized how impactful it could be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think about that, and Jerry, you've talked about this so many times as well, just like how these amazing coaches that you've gotten to work with, whether it was a Steve or a Cindy Timshall or an Anson or Jenny Levy or these, Nancy Stevens, whatever, like they just bring in like this level of vulnerability. Because I mean, when you started coaching, if you talked about being vulnerable or whatever, like actually as a 21-year-old coach coaching 22-year-olds, you can't be very vulnerable because they'll walk all over you. Like you at that point, you need to display competence and then be vulnerable. But now in leadership, forget just sports, right? We understand the importance of these things and how people respond to that. And I think this evolution has been incredibly important, led by Brene Brown and others. But it's almost like she's teaching now what coaches like yourself have understood for a long time.
Well, and I would say that she probably has understood it for a long time too, based on her research. But I think it comes down to like, how do you apply it once you understand it? Because it's easy to understand that trust is important in any type of relationship. It's harder to apply it when you're in the throes of it, And I've worked with some coaches that, I've had some younger coaches on my staff, and we've talked a lot about this topic. And one of the things I've said is like, look, if you cannot coach someone on your team that you've had a beef with, you will not be able to coach anyone on your team because at some point you've pissed off everyone. As soon as you've made a starting lineup, you've made a decision that's not made a lot of people happy, And so to me, it's always like, how can I start like at a fresh mentality every day with every player? And that's not easy because as humans, like we store things that have happened, but in the end, like if I want to get the best out of that player, like I have to give them the benefit of the doubt more often than not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Were you intentional about that? I mean, like I think about all the ways now that we can, mess up, tidy up, if you will, right? And Jerry, you talk about like, hey, I've been married for this long because I don't go to bed angry. Like we deal with it. And I think this is like, if you have a bad interaction with an athlete and you try to catch him at the end of practice. If you don't catch him there, can you send him a text? Can you send him, hey, that didn't come out right. I don't like how that ended. You have a quick second to chat. I mean, was that something that you were always very intentional about, those one-on-one interactions?
Yeah, absolutely. And that carried on pretty much throughout my career. We had individual meetings with players all the time. And it's interesting because, I had a player that had transferred into us at Florida, and we literally have weekly meetings. So it's either with me or one of our other coaches that you have a weekly meeting. And she said, well, the only time before I would ever meet with my coaches if I was in trouble or like at the very beginning or at the end of the season. And here she's meeting with somebody every week. And sometimes it's like, well, what are you talking about in those meetings? And one of the questions I always loved to lead with in my meetings was, what's the most important thing we should be talking about right now? And let them take it, because I might think it's going to be about playing time or it's going to be about this or that. And then they tell me, and maybe it's something totally different, or maybe it starts somewhere and goes somewhere else. I mean, I remember one time a player said the answer to that question was her chemistry class. And in my mind, as a solver of problems for people, which like coaches we tend to sometimes be, I'm thinking to myself, well, let's get a tutor. Like that's what I'm thinking in my mind. Luckily, I didn't say it out loud because I just started asking her some more questions about it. And she was basically, we got down to the nitty gritty of it. And it was, that class was a weed out class in her major. That major was to go pre-med. She didn't really want to go pre-med, but she was the first person in her family to go to college. And there was an expectation that's what she wanted to do. And she didn't know how to tell her family that's not what she wanted to do. That was a way different solution than getting her a tutor. And if I hadn't, if I hadn't asked more questions, I would have lined up a tutor, and that conversation would have lasted 30 seconds.
Yeah. John and I, we have this methodology. It's an acronym. It's called LUV, which interestingly enough says love, right? But the very first letter, L, is listening. And so many coaches, so many leaders are not listening, they're hearing. So what you did was, I'm just trying to differentiate these two things. You heard her say about her coursework, and then what you tried to do is jump in and fix it. Like so many of us, I'm really good at that. I'm a guy, guys fix things, right? They don't listen. So listening is really asking yourself the question, what can I learn here? And then you learn by understanding, asking questions, and then you get more information. Then finally you can validate whatever you need to validate as a coach. But that listening is something, John, just give me a few extra minutes here. I've been like, oh my God, type of feeling right now. And I'm not kidding. I just have so much on my mind, but I want to take advantage of you right now. You're talking about implementation of these values, and it's so important. But what I'm really picking up on, two things. Number one is Brene Brown, her brilliance. When I first heard her, it wasn't what she was saying. It was, or what she was doing. It was how she made me feel. And I felt really, really good. And the reason I felt good was because everything she was talking about, she was being. And she was modeling vulnerability. She was like the most amazing, vulnerable TED Talk speaker I had ever listened to. And I'm sitting here listening to you, and you're modeling humility. We can hear that. And I just want to point that out. You're modeling being vulnerable. And it's part of your system right now. It's in you. And from the age of 21, I remember the first time at the age of 22, right out of college, I walked into a high school classroom and taught English literature at 22. And the head of the department said to me, if you want to be successful, don't smile until Christmas. Well, what the heck was he saying? It's like, don't be vulnerable, be careful. But you know what? In retrospect, he was right, because I didn't know anything. I was one day ahead of the students in English Lit. I didn't know what the heck I was teaching the next day or how to teach it. So I really put on that serious face, the lack of vulnerability. Of course, ever since then, how many years ago was that? 50 plus years. I'm sitting here thinking, I want to become more vulnerable, which means I want to really be honest with myself. I want to trust myself that no matter how silly I sound right now, that it's going to be okay and my intention is pure. So back to you.
Well, I want to say one thing about the Brene Brown thing. So I did do the Dare to Lead training, and here's what was amazing about that training. It was about, I think it was like a 2.5-day training. And it was the very first one she ever had for Dare to Lead. And I guess there was, I don't know, over 100 people in the room. And she taught the entire training herself. There were other people supporting it, like telling us where to go for lunch and things like that. But literally all the training was 100% her. And there were times, like, I remember one of the afternoons, we took a major detour into like a DEI space because that's where the room took it. And I really respected that about her. And now, like, as I work with Brett Ledbetter, like, it's the same thing. Like when Brett and I present, I used to get so stressed out all the time. Like, I'm a control freak. I'm a coach. Like, I want to know what I'm going to do, and Brett is so good, on the fly in terms of like being able to take it where the audience takes it, and you don't know where they're going to take it. And so I've gotten a lot less stressed out about that, and a lot more trust in myself to say, like, okay, wherever this goes, we're going to have a good discussion, regardless of whether it's what I planned. And it leads me finally into, Brett has just written a new book. It's actually not even out yet. It's called Question-Based Leadership. And the thing it's like magic. Like, and this is, I think, what John, you were saying earlier, when you allow the questions to happen, because as coaches, like, I wasn't really coached as a coach asking me my opinion on a lot of things. They just told me a lot of stuff and I did it. And I didn't even ask questions because the coach was the ultimate authority. We know that this generation doesn't respond as well to that. So this idea of questions and helping them own the information, it's not a manipulation just to help them own it. It's to help them build their own confidence inside and their own inner coach so that they have the answers and they don't have to rely on me for the answers. Doesn't mean I don't want them to come and ask me questions, but I would feel much better if I am helping them source their own answers as opposed to me providing them the answers.
Brilliant, brilliant. Yeah, John, can I just go with this?
Of course.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Let's just stick with the vulnerable piece because I'm really intrigued by that with you. And of course, I think without vulnerability, there's no coaching. Ultimately, I mean, when you're transparent, people relate to that. When they relate to that, there's connection, and that's like the number one important item for all of us to have is connection. When you have that connection, people go the distance. They'll do anything. It's a wonderful phenomenon. So John and I just ran our 7th annual conference in Denver on coaching and leadership. And at the very end, we spent 3 days getting together. And basically what we're doing is we're training them in the Way of Champions leadership profile and how to be that way. And John and I are actually being what we're teaching, which I think is really unique in a lot of conferences. One of the things we did at the end of the conference, the very last day, the very last half hour was we conducted a flash mob. Now, you got to understand, these are not people that don't know us now. After 3 days, they get a good sense about who we are. So staying with the vulnerability piece, I happened to do some research and I found out that you've actually been part of a flash mob.
It was one of my goals in life.
Oh my God. And you do it again. So
I would definitely do it again. I would definitely do it again.
Stay with that thought about it. It's one of the goals of your life. For you personally, what I'm sorry, I interrupted there.
No, go for it.
But I was just thinking, is this not related or I'm missing something to everything we're talking about in terms of being vulnerable, trusting, connection, caring? Give me your experience. Tell me why that was so important to you.
Well, I mean, there's been this video that's been, on social media forever, since the beginning of social media. And it's like in a plaza in Europe. This guy comes out and he's playing his violin, and then all of a sudden more musicians add. And it's this giant orchestra by the end, and everybody in the crowd is into it and everything. And I mean, that is inspiring to me. Yeah. One, because of the first guy just having the courage to get out there and stand out there and do it. Then to have more people join him, but they are connected to him, right? So they're playing the same piece of music and they're complementing and supplementing what he's doing. And then for the crowd to get engaged in what is happening. I mean, it's the surprise factor, it's the connection, it's the engagement, like all of that. So when I was coaching at Florida, Sarah Loudon, one of our people on our staff, she knew I always wanted to be in a flash mob. So she created a flash mob at the very end of my career. It was our team, and it was a surprise flash mob. It was so cool. It was just really fun, and I would totally do it again because I just think that there's something about like large group harmony when everybody is engaged in the same thing for the same intent that makes it really cool.
Mm-hmm. And it's a lot of fun, and it's connective, and it really does send the message: we are connected, we are together. And so for so many years, and John, maybe you feel this way, and Becky, maybe you too. I stood on the sideline, and I envied all the dancers who had all the nerve, right? And the first time I got the nerve, I walked across a gym. I was 16 years old, and I asked this young girl to dance, and she looked at me right in the eye and says, "No way." and the longest walk I ever took was back to the other side where all the guys were standing. Talk about vulnerability. So it took me a long time, and John had never seen this part of me, but I said to him, I've got to do something here that's different. And honest to God, John, when you look back on that, and I look, it was like, it made sense. It just made sense. It's a team. We were a team at that point, and we were all together. Coaches, teachers, everyone, cameramen, they were all there dancing. And so I guess maybe we could just recommend the coaches who are listening, find ways to get that flash mob going and see what you can do in terms of team building, right?
Let me tell you one really
Yeah.
good resource for that.
Yeah.
I wish I could remember the title of this video, but if you go on YouTube, it's a guy that's dancing at like a park, and he's dancing crazy, like by himself, 100% by himself. And then another guy joins him, and then another guy joins him, and then it's like this huge group of people dancing at like this music festival or something. And the lesson of it is like, okay, the first guy dancing, he's just kind of like a Looney Tune, right? But then when he gets his first follower, all of a sudden it becomes a thing, you know? And so it talks about the role of the first follower. And that to me is a really great video to sort of talk about like that social contagion of, you know, if you can get someone to follow you, you become a leader. But then what they talk about in this video is it's not really about the leader anymore. It's about the group. And so the leader just got it started, and the first follower was really important to that getting it started. But then it becomes about the group.
But that leader has to have an element of trust and an element of caring and being free and not really caring about what people think about us. And on a soccer pitch, isn't that a way to play? Imagine if we don't care what the outcome is and what people think about us. We're just going to go out there and we're going to freaking run it to death. And we're going to be the hardest working team on the field. And to have that leadership on your team is just precious. But John, you have to be very happy to hear about what Becky just said about that film. You know the name of it, right?
Well, yeah, it's just called The First Follower. Yeah.
Yeah.
Derek Sievers. We love that video. I've shown that at many talks because, you know, the concept, right, is, you know, you're a lone nut dancing by yourself until someone has the courage to join in and do the same. And I think, you know, we always tie that back from in a coaching perspective to the type of coaching that we're talking about here, that we talk about with Way of Champions, that you all talk about with What Drives Winning. This type of leadership that focuses on, you know, the relationships first, and trust and connection and caring and love and all these words, right? Sometimes you know, you're, as a coach, you're the lone nut preaching this, right? Because it's much easier in sport to rule through fear and intimidation. And our society still, to an extent, right? If we have a coach who, you know, leads through love and caring and whatever, and it's getting better, oftentimes, and if that coach, he or she, isn't successful, they say, they're too soft. And when you have a coach who leads through fear and intimidation and doesn't build relationships, and they're not successful, society says, those players are too soft, right? And it's shifting because we have examples of coaches like the ones you're putting forward in your conference, and like Steve or Pete Carroll or Sean McVay, or, you know, who are about these relationships, that it's getting better. But it sounds like from your career, you were at least allowed to coach like that from the get-go, Becky. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but the people that you were surrounded by at Florida saw the power in that type of leadership.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm going to give that a little thought, but I think that I felt very supported in both the Barry environment and the Florida environment, and I felt like people were wanting me to be successful. And I know not every coach has that experience. And I wish they would, because there is a definite freedom about that feeling. But I also think it comes down to you also having to find that within yourself and not necessarily outside of yourself, because you do have to swim upstream if you want to do something different. And so, for example, like at a place like Florida or any school of that profile, results matter. Like that's people get hired and fired based on results. There's no question about that. But if you can trust yourself enough to do it the way that you want to do it and not have to follow someone else's lead because you see that being successful, like you trust that you can do it the way you want to do it, that to me is where you really find it on the inside, not the outside. Because there'll be plenty, I mean, you could find criticism of everything you do anywhere you look, especially now with social media. It lives on and on and on. So you can't look outside anymore because there's just so much noise. But how do you build a person's inside to be strong enough to rely on that? And I think to me, like that's what real coaching is like even these athletes, if I played poorly in a game in college, maybe what 100 people knew about that, and that was it, and it was over. Now people can look at the stat sheet and say, oh, she didn't even play, or she played 15 minutes out of a 90-minute game, or man, she missed a sitter inside the 6 at the end of the game to win it. Like, and it lives forever, and there's so much pressure with that. So how do I, if I can't block that out because I'm surrounded by it, how do I discern that in terms of how to filter what's important to me and what I'm going to allow to affect my emotions?
It's incredibly important. Now, how about the difference between this type of coaching and being, I mean, I feel like there's a double standard between being a male coach and a female coach in this as well. So one thing that we might praise a male for, we would criticize a woman for. Any thoughts on that? I know you've had discussions about this many times of being a female coach, and it's in a very difficult environment. What are your thoughts?
No, I think you can't discount gender roles in coaching or in any field, to be fair. And I think there are certain expectations that apply to women and men a little bit differently. And so you can't discount that, but at the same time, I think you can sort of choose again to be like who you want to be and not based on the whims and wishes of people on the outside telling you what you should or shouldn't be. Like if I want to be a tough coach, like a tough love coach, they should be able to do that just as well as if I want to be a caring coach, or if a male wants to be a caring coach. And I think that's where that courage to swim upstream really comes in. And I'll give you a really easy example of that. That's not necessarily gender roles, but it's like at Florida, I think I have a lot of diverse interests. Like I like a lot of things. I like art, music. I like
Scuba diving.
Yeah, scuba diving, like you name it. So I felt like it was up to me to protect my mental space in terms of me being the best for my team. It wasn't up to someone else to do that. And so if I did that differently than someone else, it would be very easy to look left or right and be like, oh, she's not the grinder, and have people feel a certain way about that. And for me to then feel a certain way about that. But what I always felt like, and I felt like this with my coaches too, like there's nothing more important than me bringing my best possible energy to my team. There's nothing more important. And if that means I don't get, that last expense report done from last weekend's recruiting weekend, as opposed to having a conversation with a player who needs it, I'm picking the conversation with the player every time. I'm going to get my other stuff done, but I'm also going to protect my space in terms of my energy and pouring into the energy of the people who need it.
Well, let me ask, because this is, I think, is getting at the heart of a challenge that many coaches face today. I think, especially on the collegiate level, right? And you mentioned before, and feel free to talk as much or as little about this as you feel comfortable doing, but you became the interim coach of Orlando in the NWSL. You'd been the coach of a Division I university for 29 years, I think it was, right? You've coached Abby Wambach and Danielle Fotopoulos and All-Americans and national team players and pros. And here you are, and you're still, like you said, a little bit nervous. But for people who don't know, you also came in, at sort of, we have the Yates report. We have coaches all across the NWSL being dismissed for a variety of things, some that have so clearly crossed the line that it's a no-brainer. But then I think there's other things where, like, did you ever feel in that moment, I have to hold back from being myself because of the environment I just stepped in? Because I talk to a lot of, and Jerry talks, we talk to a lot of college coaches right now who are like, man, I feel like if I push, right, if I make people uncomfortable and get them out of their comfort zone from the work, fitness, strength and conditioning, their dedication to the team, I'm going to get reported to the athletic director. Was there anything, it was part of your discomfort in like this environment? Can I even be myself? I mean, I have no idea how much you can talk about, but
No, I mean, my discomfort, if I'm being really honest, in that environment was like, okay, we had like Marta, Alex Morgan,
yeah,
Ashlyn Harris, Sid LaRue. I mean, like you
yeah,
name, like that team was freaking loaded, you know?
yeah.
And like all these players who have this amazing amount of international experience and just savviness in terms of the environment. And here I am, a college coach, walking into this environment and thinking like, I mean, what are they even going to think about that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it was actually, it was good because ultimately we wanted to qualify for the playoffs that year and we didn't.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, like that was such a tumultuous year in the NWSL, and kind of felt like just being myself in that environment in terms of like, all right, we're going to address the needs of the players at that time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a perfect example of that was, you know, Alex Morgan is very good friends with Mana Shim. Mana Shim was very involved with all of that was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And Mana happened to be in Orlando at that time. And we're like, let's bring Mana in to talk to our team. Like, let's talk about the elephant in the room, basically, that's going on in this league right now. And so I think in some ways, I actually felt very comfortable in that environment because of what was going on in that particular year. It was not uncomfortable for me at all to try and talk about things that really weren't on the field things, because we've done that all along in my career. It was more just an intimidation factor for me of like, what am I going to have to offer Marta? You know,
Mm-hmm.
and so that part for me, and I do feel like I was able to, like, and I think that's it, pro coaching in a nutshell is like, you definitely have to be competent enough to help those players see that you can forward them in their quest, whatever that quest is. So I'm not dismissing the need for competence,
Mm.
but I also think that competence comes in a lot of different forms for a lot of different people. And
Mm.
you don't know what that is until you know those people.
Well, I think you walked in, that question that you said you always pose to your players, was the most important thing we should be talking about right now in that situation, was an incredibly powerful question, because it wasn't whether we'll play a 4-2-3-1 or whatever. Like, that's not what was at the forefront of their minds in that moment. And so it sounds like you were the perfect person in that moment to step in front of that group, because this goes back to, also, these are human beings, right? That they have cares and lives outside of soccer that are bigger. And certainly women in the women's national team has fought for issues much bigger than winning the next game for the last couple of years. So it's interesting. It's interesting to do that. Sorry,
Well,
I'm
and
just kind of
and
going, yeah.
just to go back a little bit to what you said about coaches thinking, well, if I can't push people because I'm going to get reported to my
Yeah,
athletic,
yeah, yeah.
I think that's a real thing. Like I don't I think it's a very difficult role to be a coach right now
Yeah.
at any level, right? At any level. But I think if we take our cues from professional coaches, and this is where I've been really lucky to be involved with Brett in What Drives Winning, because he deals with a lot of professional players and coaches and can kind of pass on some of that wisdom. Like there is no one coming to watch an NBA game to watch the NBA coach. Matter of
Right.
fact, if you named me 6 NBA teams, I could probably come up with maybe 2 of their coaches if I'm
Right.
lucky. But I could probably tell you a ton of their star players.
Yeah.
So learning that you have to kind of find a way to impact but disappear within that environment is really a great lesson for all of us as coaches, because whatever level we are, if we're coaching under 12 girls club soccer, or if we're coaching college at a high level, you can find a way to impact, but you can also find a way to sort of like align self-interest of the player and your own team. I think where the conflict comes in is when the coach is sort of using the players as pawns to advance their own career. Everybody sees that, and nobody wants to be part of that.
Yeah.
And you will maybe be part of it because it's like, okay, if I have to get to where I want to go, then I'll do it. But it doesn't feel good to anybody. So it's like, what is your intent in what you're trying to do? I think that matters, and it shows up in the energy that you coach with.
Yeah, I think it's tough. And sorry, Jerry, I'm just going to sort of ask one more follow up, like, but because you said like soccer, right? You've got 11 people on the field, they're happy. And then you've got, in some cases, 19 people who are unhappy, right? And that's the difficulty and the challenge of how do I keep pushing them and unhappy. And I think one of the shifts, especially in some of the biggest, with the amount of money in Division I Power 5 conferences, is how many athletic directors have been culled from the non-sports world. Whereas 20 years ago they all had a background in coaching, right? And now all of a sudden they don't, and so they don't understand that dynamic. Like, well, of course somebody's unhappy, right? Because they're not getting to play. And how do you sift through what is the real reason you're not happy? It's because you're not getting in the game. Well, okay, versus, oh, there's a problem here. And I just know so many coaches who have said, I feel like I'm under a microscope. I feel like I have to record every single meeting. I can't do a one-on-one meeting anymore because I don't know if my words will get twisted. And this is like you said, it's a really challenging environment to coach in right now, for sure.
I had a coach give me some really good advice one time, and he said, I had a large team one of my last years at Florida, and I was concerned going into the season because of the large roster. And he said, at the end of the season, if people want to leave for more opportunity, then you have to be okay with that. And honestly, you should try and help them find the best opportunity they can.
Mm-hmm.
However, if people leave at the end of the season because they felt like you didn't invest in them, then that's on you.
Mm-hmm.
And so his challenge to me was like, how are you going to invest in the people on your roster, regardless of whether they're in your regular playing rotation or not?
Yeah.
And it was a good piece of advice. And it was a good challenge. And we did have people leave at the end of the season who wanted more opportunity, but I felt like all of those were mutually good partings, and we did our best to try and help people find situations that would fit them better. And I think I had to continually ask them and ask myself throughout the course of the year, like one of the questions I would ask the players is, in what way can I invest in you besides playing time? Like, what am I not doing? And I think that helped them. And then I actually had to follow through on it. And I think that helped them understand that it wasn't just a transactional environment.
Yeah. And I think one of the challenges sometimes is, right, the person who wants more playing time, we step in, we help them. This just isn't the right fit for you, or you're stuck behind so-and-so and they're an All-American and they got 2 more years. I think sometimes the biggest issue becomes the player who isn't going to play, but also doesn't want to leave, and then becomes the cancer in the locker room, right? They don't adhere to the values. They don't work hard, but they're also not giving up their spot either. And that's the challenge I see lots of people negotiating is, and this goes into early sports specialization and people showing up at a college and they're totally burnt out and there's no love of the sport and they're not investing in getting better, but they're like, but I'm here. I have all this stuff, advantages, and I don't want to leave. I don't want to give up my spot. And then they become the cancer. And that's, I see, is one of the biggest challenges for coaches right now.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you on that. And I think that's where I love this book that, like I said, that Brett's come out with, this question-based leadership, because you can sort of attack those issues through questions as opposed to saying, hey, you're not following our standards, and if you don't, this is what's going to happen. That might be a temporary solution, but in the end, you haven't really changed thoughts or behaviors there. And so how do you find a way to change thoughts and behavior so that it's their idea to make those decisions? And then, I mean, it's not easy. There's no question it's not easy. But I do think unlocking people, everybody has reasons why they stay or why they go. And if we can find a way to meet them where they are, as opposed to try and force them in a certain direction, I think it's usually a better outcome.
Love it. There's so much good stuff. Jerry, jump in here at any moment.
I'd like to jump in and kind of just shift the emphasis here a little bit, because I think we'd be remiss, Becky, if we didn't take advantage of the fact that you are a high level, well-spoken, articulate female coach in this world where so many female teams are being coached by men, and so many female coaches out there are not getting a chance maybe to coach those teams. You had an interesting conversation that I listened to recently with Patty Gasso from Oklahoma, softball coach, iconic in her own right. Legend, right? As you are, for sure. And what I came away with there was wanting to take a deep dive into how to help women coaches out there be successful. What does success look like? And I'm not talking about the won and loss record. I'm talking about being a successful coach, which is really, if I summed up everything that you're talking about, it wasn't about being 26-1 one season, winning a national championship against UNC. None of that stuff comes to my mind. What comes to my mind is you're a successful female coach because what you did was you entered the arena in a complex, uncertain world. And I think there's a lot of young women out there that listen to this podcast. And what do you have to say to them? Like, what is success for them? And how do they stay focused on that without getting distracted by, they're not good enough and all of these kind of concepts?
Well, I had a really big turning point in my career. I went to the NCAA Women's Coaches Academy, and Dr. Christine Grant, who is
God, my,
she's a legend in field hockey.
Oh, she's amazing.
She challenged us to say, like, what are you doing to give back to women coaches? And my answer at that time was like, not a whole lot. Like, I don't know, I had really done anything at that point. And as a matter of fact, if I'm being really honest, like, I kind of felt like I was trying to prove myself in this man's world. So I was almost separating myself a little bit from the women's coaches, because I wanted to make sure that I could stand on my own 2 feet in this world. And so after that, like, it was a definite, like, wake up call for me. And, one of the things that I tried to do after that meeting was, like, if there was a coach that was fired, let's say, or under pressure or whatever, like, trying to reach out and create some community for that person, because that's where people always talk about the good old boys network, and they think of that like kind of in a negative way when they say it. What I will say about the good old boys networks, man, they got that support system down good. Like, it's like there's something about that where you can recycle a coach, and NFL coach gets fired and all of a sudden they're a position coach, a coordinator, and they're back as a head coach. Like, in our situation as women, a lot of times someone gets fired or even gets an investigation or gets under pressure or whatever, like, they just want to go. They want to be out of it. And so how do we create a situation where that person can feel supported in those times? So that's one thing. I think the other part of that is, like, it's very easy to sort of also, like, isolate yourself, and you, like you said, not step into the arena. And I mean, I remember that Final Four that you were referencing. The other 3 coaches were Jerry Smith, who was the U21 coach at that time. Amazing. I mean, he's been one of the top American coaches ever. Clive Charles, who at the time was like my hero. Like, Clive Charles coached at Portland, and I thought he was the best coach in America. Like, he made so much sense to me. And I remember one time Clive Charles walked by me doing like this tiny training session with people, and we were doing something with throw-ins, and he said something to me about it that night, and I was like, oh my God, he saw me. Like, I was just like honored. And then the other one was Anson, and Anson too has been always like open door, like if you want to know something, you can call Anson and he will answer your question. But a lot of people won't have the courage to do that, like to step into and ask him that question. Can I come observe your training? Because he's probably going to say yes.
Mm.
And so, like, it's not easy to like jump into that environment and feel like super confident, like, oh, I can go toe to toe with these three amazing coaches. But if you don't believe in you, then why would anyone else? And so it's kind of like, again, like I may not believe in my ability to have as much experience as those three guys, even in like one of their pinkies, probably. But I could find a way to believe in myself in the other things that we were doing with our team that maybe they weren't. And like, I think that's the key, is to like really feel like you can do something that you believe in and that you are wholeheartedly in, and that you can take confidence from your ability to do that. It may not be the same as somebody else's. So as soon as you're looking to compare yourself to other people, you're going to lose confidence. But if you can just stay focused on what it is that you feel good about you, that's where, to me, like, you can really gain some confidence.
Well, you just hit the operative word, comparison. I think no matter who, all three of us, once we start comparing ourselves to other people, it goes nowhere. And
Right.
and so I guess when I'm listening to you, it does kind of circle back to trusting in yourself, which you mentioned right at the top of the broadcast. And we can't emphasize that enough. And to take chances and to take risks. I'm summarizing what I hear you say, and reach out and not and trust yourself that it's going to be okay, no matter how great you, or what kind of a pedestal you put somebody on. Ultimately, they're a human being, and they get up in the morning and they do the same thing you do.
Jerry, just thought of something in my mind when you said that. So, my parents were huge supporters of mine, but they also weren't like they weren't sports people. So they didn't really, it wasn't like they were fans. They were just my parents. And my mom was extremely compassionate person. Like, she spent most of her life in a wheelchair. She was very positive, and always, like, her number one thing that she would always say is, there's always somebody who's got it worse than you. So I kind of got that vibe from my mom. My dad, on the other hand, was like a figure it out kind of guy. Like, so if you wanted to do something, like, I wanted to have a car when I was 16. He's like, well, then you probably need to get a job so you can get some money so you can buy a car, But like, he then helped me shop for a car, and he helped me fix a car that was within my budget because I wasn't going to buy a new car, like, so like, having those two influences, like, my dad's figured out, like, always putting us in that situation, like, hey, you want to like use power tools when you're 12 years old? Here's how they work. And now you try it. Like, I mean, I don't think a lot of parents would give you that kind of independence to be able to do that. But that grew confidence in me. I wanted to go to college and play soccer. That was not really in the realm of my parents' thinking. But, I found a way to raise enough money to be able to go to college and play soccer. And that gave me confidence because I did it. So I had that like confidence and compassion, and those two influences played such a huge role in my coaching that I don't even think my parents really knew how much of a role they played in that.
And then for those who are listening and not watching, Becky has all 10 fingers. So she made it through her power tools lesson as a child. This is amazing. That was a great question and a great answer. I think as we come to the end, I would be remiss where if I didn't ask you. We just finished the Women's World Cup. Unbelievable spectacle. Sad in the US that we had to wake up at 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. to try to watch games. So we watched a lot of recorded games. But we have this place in women's soccer now where I went to Barcelona Roma Champions League in March, 60,000 people at the Camp Nou. We're filling stadiums. We have a World Cup selling out huge stadiums, and also a much more global game than there was 15, 20 years ago. Other countries are investing. Spain just showed us what they did. What are your thoughts? And then, I know you're doing some advisory work for Jacksonville USL. So a new, focus on women's professional soccer below the NWSL. what do you see as the future? What do we have to do in the US to keep up with the investment the rest of the world is starting to make?
Boy, that's like the $1 million question, isn't it? I mean, the hardest part about the US is also its greatest strength. We are a giant country with a lot of people and a lot of options and a lot of pathways, pathways in college, pathways in professional. And it's like smaller countries are almost at an advantage because their identity and their pathway can be so much more united.
Mm-hmm.
So I think part of the question is, how do we decide on, even from an identity perspective? Like I think about like the old days of the national team. Anson was coaching that team. A great deal of those players went to Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty small ecosystem because you're being trained on the regular in the same way that the national team is playing. Now we are much more diverse as a country in terms of where our players are coming from. Some are going a direct professional path, some are still going through college, many are still going through college, but they're not all going to one college anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we bring all that diversity together and decide on an identity? And I think it's challenging because we have this American grit and this American fitness and mentality and all of that. But we also are now developing players who have a great tactical awareness of the game, great technical skill. And if we can combine all that together, man, we've got it locked. But that's the hardest part, is combining it, because it feels like sometimes there's either like the grit path or the tactical technical route, and neither the two shall meet. And we got to figure out a way for those to come together, because we just saw the power of that in a team like Spain, where everybody was talking about their ability to possess. What impressed me was their ability to defend in numbers and to really shut down anything. And we're going to have to evolve, just like we talked about at the top of this. Coaches have to evolve, players have to evolve, systems have to evolve. And right now I think we're in a transitionary period from a system standpoint with where are we going to go with this whole developmental process.
Yeah, no, it's a
Wow.
interesting thing, right? And I think about this because my friends in other countries say, why can't the US get it together? And I say, well, the kid who grows up in Florida and plays year-round outdoors, and half the time, it's 100 degrees out and you have to sit back and play slow and whatever, versus the kid who grows up in Seattle and plays 8 months of the year in rain. You're going to look for different qualities. How do you blend that together? Or, how do you build a national team that really only focuses on one? And if we're going to play a World Cup in the winter, maybe we want more Seattle kids. And if we're going to play a World Cup in Qatar, we want more Florida kids or something like that. I think your first statement, that our greatest strength is also sometimes the greatest
challenge. Yeah.
Greatest
think
challenge.
about, like, even Spain, like, think of the ecosystem for them. What was it? 7 of the 11 starters were from Barcelona, right? And so,
right. Plus a chunk of the ones that got left home.
Right.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
similar situation, small ecosystem. That Barcelona team is playing very similarly to the way that the national team is playing, and the success that follows that. Like, small and controlled is easier than large and diverse. However, large and diverse offers more opportunity if we can find a way to harness that. That's the big if.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think, let me just make this point too, because as an athlete myself, distance running was my game. I look at the African runners. I think there's an element of this that's involved. The U.S. is diverse. It's huge. It has all of the money that it needs. It has this kind of training, that kind of training. But in Africa, it's small and concise, and it's together. But why they're competing is not to really just win a race. They're competing to win a life, to get out of Ethiopia, and to create something for themselves. They can show up at the New York Marathon and win the marathon, and that brings their whole family and country together. Maybe I'm wrong here, correct me, but I remember when Japan beat the US several years ago. Like, it was Japan playing for the love of their country more, to me, than the US, who were maybe playing more for the love of maybe a contract. or where they go. So I don't know how much truth there is in that, but I think that plays a role.
Well, I think both of you guys know the power of purpose because you talk about it a lot in your work. And there's no doubt that purpose can drive some like just results you can't even imagine if you have a strong purpose. And there's something to be said for what you just said, Jerry.
Yeah. We have it easy in this country in many ways. I saw my 4 kids grow up. They had an easy life, they didn't suffer. Well, the same 4 kids from Barcelona might be different.
Totally.
Anyway,
Well,
yeah.
I think my last thought, and this isn't necessarily a question or anything I'll ask you to comment on because we could then go another hour on it, but
Yeah,
well, I was
easily.
very intentional looking at that Spain team, and it's publicly known their disputes with their coach. And I was, remember after the quarterfinal going, wow, they just won a quarterfinal and no one's celebrating with the coach. And I really do think that the purpose of that team was the players playing for each other because of the potentially toxic environment that existed. And their purpose was probably a dislike of their coach, or maybe even a stronger word. And I think we'll hear more about that in the months to come here. But yeah, that was something very, very obvious to me of there was no love between the coach and players and player and coach, the way that they celebrated that. And that's what they came together in that. So anyway, we won't have to touch that one unless you want to, but I'll give you the final thought, Becky, and then also tell people how they can connect with you these days, what drives winning, Brett's new book, all that fun stuff.
Well, I just appreciate the work that you all do. I think, like I said at the very beginning, it's so easy to find X's and O's information. It's so hard to find the stuff that you guys are dedicated towards. And that's to me is the art of coaching. The rest of it is, it has its challenges and there's some fun parts of that too. But to me, this is what gives coaching its richness. So really appreciate the work that you guys are doing. And in terms of what drives winning, it's really easy. People can just go to whatdriveswinning.com. We got a lot of free resources there and on YouTube. And that's our goal, is to try and sort of bring coaches to people who might not otherwise have a way to connect with them. And anybody who wants to reach out to me, Becky at whatdriveswinning.com is my email. It's super easy. And I'm excited. We're teaching classes now at the University of Florida at the master's level. Each of Brett's books has become a master's level class, and that's been really, really fun. I've always felt like coaching and teaching were pretty intertwined, and I can feel it now more than ever with teaching those classes at UF. And they're online, so we get tons of people from all over the place, and it's a great experience that I've really been enjoying.
Love it. Fantastic.
Wow.
Well, this was a great conversation, Becky. Thank you so much for carving out some time on your summer vacation to have this conversation with Jerry and I. We truly appreciate it. And I think I've got tons of notes. I know Jerry does. So much for everyone who's listened to this. So thanks for being on The Way of Champions.
It was my pleasure.
Wow, Jerry, that conversation with Becky was amazing.
I can't say enough of how riveted I felt during that conversation. Now it's getting to a point where I'm feeling every time we have these podcasts, I'm saying the same thing, like this is better, this is the best. But you know what? It's just absolutely spot on. Her question, that question, what's the most important thing we should be talking about right now to her athletes? I'm going to use that in my daily life. Like,
oh yeah,
when Jan comes home from work today, like, what should we be talking about right now? What's important? Because I know something's on her mind, but it opens up the whole door. She is the most, John.
I mean, to ask that question and then to approach the answer with, Betsy Butterick's sort of, what can I learn here?
Yeah,
like that's
right.
it, right?
Yeah,
and I mean, as she talked about, right, that they intentionally, met with every player individually over and over and over.
Yeah.
And the one player she talked about, right? Like, oh, whenever I met with my coaches in the past, it was because we did something wrong or we messed up. And sort of this is this whole thing of like, no, this is just a consistent thing that we are checking in. And it's a lot of time for a coach. And granted, a college coach has more time to do it than a high school coach.
Right.
But
right.
just that, and maybe a college coach can do a 30-minute meeting, while as a high school coach, you get 2 minutes to check in. How are you doing? Right? Is there anything that we need to talk about? What's the most important thing we could talk about right now? I agree. I'm going to sort of add that to my repertoire as well.
Yeah. And so the other thing too that I pick up on really strongly is she models exactly what she's teaching. So a lot of coaches are listening to us and they're wondering, what's my role in terms of being more vulnerable or being humble? You just saw one of the best, if not close to the best, women's coaches in this country ever, who was demonstrating that, not intentionally, she just learned how to be that way and saw the advantage with her team, how to be vulnerable, how to be humble. But again, we get back to that statement that Steve Kerr made. You can be vulnerable and you can be humble, but you got to make sure you know what you're doing. You got to know your stuff. And she obviously knew her stuff. But boy, to start at the age of 21 and walk into a room, a locker room filled with some people that were older than her, that's amazing.
Yeah,
So,
it's scary stuff for sure. Well, that was fantastic. Again, you can connect with Becky at whatdriveswinning.com. I highly recommend. I'm on their email list. They release some great newsletters and a lot of video clips from their different conferences and interviews with some unbelievable coaches. So it's well worth a great source of information. Obviously, we've had Brett on the podcast. His book, What Drives Winning, and this new book sounds fascinating as well.
I definitely will get a copy of that one.
We'll get him back on.
Maybe we get him back on for that book
when the book comes out, for sure.
That would be great. Great.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna call Alan sometime today. I'm actually gonna call him and I'm gonna extend an invitation to our podcast.
That sounds great. Well, everyone, thank you everyone for listening. Jerry sometimes forgets that we're still recording and this is the outro of the podcast.
That might be better than the podcast.
Our next business planning session. So everyone, thanks for listening. Thanks to all our Patreon podcast champs and all our supporters.
I gotta run.
Remember, your influence is never neutral, everyone. So go out there, change the world, make a difference, and we'll see you again next week.